Statistically speaking, life on the frontier was stacked against you. The land was unforgiving. Storms could starve your cattle overnight, and neighbors were often miles away when you needed them most. And then there was the matter of the Apache, warriors, whose very name settlers whispered around campfires as if saying it too loud might call them down from the hills. Popular history makes it sound like every settler carried a rifle in one hand and destiny in the other, but the truth, most were just trying to survive another day without losing their stock, their land, or their lives. Ezekiel Marsh was one of those men. Poor, weather-beaten, barely holding on to a ranch that seemed cursed to fail. He wasn't looking for glory or legend. He was just trying to keep his herd alive long enough to see spring. But fate, the frontier's cruelest gambler, had stacked the deck against him in ways he never could have imagined. Because one morning after a storm, Ezekiel walked outside and found something no rancher should ever find in his yard. 2 unconscious Apache women, and not just any women. These were giants, towering daughters of a chief, warriors in their own right, their beadwork worth more than his entire land. Helping them would mean death if the wrong eyes found out. Walking away would mean watching them die in his dirt. This is the story of a poor rancher, 2 giant sisters, and the decision that pulled him into a battle between tribal law, federal power, and the secrets of his own heart. But before we dive into the choices that changed everything, make sure to subscribe to the Sleepy Historian tonight. Leave us a comment about which forgotten stories of the Wild West you'd like to see. Next. Okay, partners, saddle up. This ride's about to begin. The storm had spent itself by dawn, leaving Ezekiel Marsh's ranch glazed in a wet grit that made every hoofprint read like a confession. He was halfway between despair and habit, checking the fence line, counting ribs on the last of his cattle, when he saw it, 2 bodies in his yard where no bodies should be. At first he thought dead steers. Then he saw beadwork catching the early light and realized they were women, Apache women, collapsed in the mud beside his failing herd. Not ordinary women. Giants. The shorter one, if shorter could apply, had to stand a good 6.5 feet when upright. Her arms, thick as fence posts, were roped with trained muscle, her clothes torn where something had slashed her side. Dark blood had soaked the leather as if the garment were drinking her. The taller one was nearly 7 feet, shoulders wider than Ezekiel's doorway, skull like a carved boulder. A gash laid open her forehead, and each breath sounded like it cost her a coin she didn't have. They wore rank, beadwork and silver that spoke highborn, the kind of ornaments Ezekiel had only heard about in frontier gossip, warrior daughters, women born to lead and to bear a people forward. They never traveled alone. They never appeared without an escort. Yet the yard was empty but for wind and wounded. Every lesson the frontier had beaten into Ezekiel rose like a draw knife. Helping Apache meant trouble. Helping Apache on a ranch 15 miles from the nearest neighbor and 40 from town meant suicide. Settlers got hanged for less, or disappeared into some legal crevice that led straight to a rope. A man could be righteous and still end up wrong on a cottonwood limb. He crouched anyway. The taller woman stirred, her eyes opening, dark, steady, as if cut from obsidian. Not hate, not the hard, holy fury he'd braced for. Fear, raw and human, the same kind that had gnawed his gut as he'd watched his herd melt into bones over the past months. She tried to speak. A deep voice rolled up out of her chest and broke into a whisper he couldn't place, then slid back into silence. Beside her, the injured sister's breathing went ragged, the wet rattle that told Ezekiel time had begun to close its fist. "Please," the conscious giant said in broken English. "Help, sister." "Damn it," Ezekiel breathed. The word, sister, fell into him like a stone into a well, rippling the memory of Elizabeth, fevered, fading, a winter he'd never stopped blaming himself for. Maybe that was why he moved. Maybe it was because the frontier's iron laws had never once fed him. He slid his arms under the wounded woman's shoulders and almost collapsed. She weighed like a dropped anvil, muscle and bone wrapped in destiny. The taller woman managed her sister's legs, swaying but upright, and together they heaved toward the cabin. Each step brought Ezekiel closer to the edge of a cliff he couldn't see. Rain scent rose in the air, braided with dust, and the faint drum of hooves. At the doorway, reality bit him. Her shoulders were simply too broad. They had to angle. Her, careful as farriers. The taller woman, "Ayanna," she rasped when he asked, peered toward the southern ridge and tightened around her sister's calves. "They come." 5 riders crowned the ridge, statues on restless horses, their faces scored with paint and purpose. Apache warriors. Ezekiel's mouth went dry. If they chose to read what they saw as betrayal, this would end in flames. Inside, he worked fast. He cut away the torn leather, cleaned the jagged wound at the ribs as best a rancher could with boiled water and whiskey, and bound it with cloth that used to be his shirt. The injured woman's eyes fluttered, fever glazed and far. Ayanna pressed a palm to her sister's sternum and spoke her name, Etel, with a softness that didn't fit the armor of her body. "Why are they after you?" Ezekiel asked, keeping his voice low. Ayanna's jaw set. Chief's son wanted Etel. She refused, a simple answer threading into a noose. Ezekiel had never loved the kind of law that made a woman's no treason, but he understood what it did to men. Who enforced it? It gave them cause. Outside, the lead warrior raised an arm and pointed down into the valley. They had found the trail of blood. Ezekiel counted bullets, 12 for the rifle, 6 for the pistol. Against 5 riders who could read country like scripture, it might as well be pebbles. Ayanna's hand closed around his forearm. What you do next decides if you live as friend or die as enemy. The door boomed under a fist, and a voice called, clear and commanding, in English. "White man, we know you inside. Come out now." Ezekiel glanced at the women, at the makeshift bandage already blotting through. He felt the choice like a brand heating in his palm. He lifted the bar. He didn't open the door yet. He spoke through it, habit born of prudence. "Name's Ezekiel Marsh." On Ayanna's nod, he added the truth that might hang him or save him. 3 moons passed, I pulled Chief Nalish's youngest from the creek and set her back on her feet. No name given, no payment asked. Silence dropped hard. Even the wind held its breath. Ezekiel felt his own breath do the same. Behind him, Etel slept in a luminous fever, Ayanna's palm on her chest like a promise. When the voice returned, it was older, steadier, the timbre of someone used to being obeyed. "Show yourself, Ezekiel Marsh. Bring the women." Ayanna helped Etel upright, the 7-foot frame bracing the 6.5-foot one with practiced ease. Etel swayed, teeth set, left hand pressed to the binding at her ribs. Ezekiel slid the bar up and pulled the door wide. 5 warriors waited in his yard, still as carved cedar. War paint lay on their faces like storm shadows. Now that he stood before them, Ezekiel counted something else. Calculation, maybe even the flicker of respect. The leader, gray threading through black hair, studied him like a ledger. "You are smaller than daughter described," he said. "She said white man was giant who fought river spirits." "Children put a shine on every story," Ezekiel managed, a corner of his mouth thinking about smiling and then wisely choosing not to. "I found her tangled in branches. I cut her free, that's all." The leader's eyes slid to the sisters. The yard itself seemed to make room for them. 2 columns of strength, beadwork marking their blood, survival writing itself along their spines. "These women brought shame to the chief's son," the warrior said. "Why do you help them?" Ezekiel chose simple. It was the only answer that could hold. Because they needed help. Same reason I helped your chief's daughter. The leader turned his horse, spoke to the others in Apache, swift, low, a current pulling decisions from stone. When he faced Ezekiel again, he had the air of a man who had found a path he could defend. Chief Knowledge comes at sunrise. He will decide if blood debt covers women's defiance. You will wait. And just like that, they pulled the night over all of them. They withdrew to the ridge, becoming silhouettes against a sky still rinsed with storm. Ezekiel eased the sisters inside and barred the door, and the cabin seemed suddenly too small for what it was meant to hold. 2 giants, 1 wounded, 1 rancher, halfway to ruin, and a dawn that would either baptize or drown them. By lamplight, he cleaned, rewrapped, cooled fever with wet cloths. Atel's wound had stopped spilling, but infection prowled the edges, red and mean. Ayanna worked, with the ease of someone who'd already traded sleep for survival too many times to count. When Ezekiel asked the question that had sat coiled in him since the threat had stepped onto his ridge, "Will your father kill me?" Ayanna didn't. "Look up. Chief Nalish is fair," she said, "but his son has many friends. They say marriage to Itel brings peace between clans." Her knot tightened, final as a verdict. Peace worth more than one white man's life. Bluntness made a cleaner wound. Ezekiel understood politics. The territory had taught him that men would trade anything they could justify with a straight face. He watched his hands work and thought about the hour before sunlight, that gray pocket where hope and dread looked like kin. Near midnight, Itel woke without the delirium glazed over everything. She spoke to Ayanna first in their language, then turned those dark, lucid eyes on him. "Thank you," she said in careful English. "Helping when help brings danger. Not common." "Common enough," Ezekiel lied, and both sisters' faces made it plain the lie was kinder than truth. They were quiet after that. Coyotes stitched calls across the valley, and the wind settled in the cottonwoods like a tired choir. When the horses came again, 3 this time, the sound braided with the coyotes until Ezekiel almost missed it. Ayanna didn't. Her body went taut as drawn bowstring. She looked, then flattened against the window. 3 riders, white men, with badges. Ezekiel's stomach went cold. If the territory's law found Apache women in his cabin, sunrise might. "Not arrive in time to save anyone." "Marsh!" a voice barked from beyond the door. Deputy Marshal William Kane. Ezekiel knew the cadence, the clean, metallic authority. "We know you're in there. Come out slow, hands where we can see." He stepped into the threshold and pulled the door to behind him, making his own body a poor shield across a small world. Kane stood in lamplight with 2 men ghosting his shoulders, hands on gun belts like it was a posture they'd slept in. "Got reports of Apache," Kane said. "Tracking put them this way after the Morrison place." The name struck the night like a thrown plate. If the Morrison ranch had been hit, settlers would raise a blood cry. Any Apache found would be shot first and sorted out later. "Haven't seen any," Ezekiel said, and even as the words left him, he felt the way they bent. Kane's gaze dropped to the porch. "Blood," he said flatly. "A lot." His man crouched, fingertip tasting the mud's memory. "Not one person," the deputy called. 2 patterns. And these prints." He turned his hand into the impression, swallowed. Huge. Kane's eyes lifted, pupil to pupil, the thread between lie and truth pulling taut. "Step away from that door." "You got a warrant?" Ezekiel asked, the question more ritual than shield. "Don't need one for Indian killers," Kane said, stepping. Ezekiel didn't let him. He lifted his voice instead, forcing calm into it like a man gentling a skittish colt. "You're right," he said. "There are Apache here. 2 women. Badly hurt. They came for help." Kane's pistol swung. "You admit harboring hostiles?" I admit I helped two dying human beings. Inside, he heard movement. The soft, heavy shift of giants preparing for a last resort. No one here would survive. But the ridge spoke first. Hooves again, many this time from the north. One of Kane's men shouted, and the marshal pivoted to the darkness. Could be more Apache, he muttered. Positions! The lawmen scattered like spilled nails, and the night, already crowded with choices, found room for one more. The new arrivals were not Apache. Torches swung like stars on ropes as more federal men dismounted in Ezekiel's yard. A sergeant stepped forward, voice pitched to carry. Orders from the territorial governor, all Apache harbored by settlers, to be brought in for questioning about the Morrison killings. Kane's confidence snapped back into place with the uniformed reinforcements. 6 armed men now penned Ezekiel's world. Search everything, Kane said, and the iron ring around. The cabin tightened. Before steel touched latch, the door opened from within. Ayanna stepped out first, a shadow turning to stone in the lamplight. The men actually rocked backward, survival instincts ringing like struck iron. 7 feet of trained purpose, injured but unbent. I am Ayanna, daughter of Chief Nailish, she said in clean, firm English. She nodded toward Ezekiel. This man saved my sister. Apache law protects those who show mercy. Etel followed, taller than most men, pale from blood loss but steady. Beads at her throat told any eye trained to read them that she came from a line that did not ask permission to exist. The lawmen's faces did a quick, involuntary math. Size, distance, draw time, wind. Apache law doesn't hold in federal. Matters, Kane said, rifle lifting. No, Ayanna replied, voice like a drum being struck. But your treaty does. The assertion landed with the satisfying crack of a well-made whip. The men glanced at one another. They'd all heard of the Winter Treaty, what the press had christened a necessary peace. But none of them had expected to be taught its footnotes in a ranch yard at midnight by a woman who could probably lift a horse. Explain, Kane said, but his voice faltered. Territorial treaty recognizes Apache law for Apache disputes, Ayanna said. Blood debts, adoptions. You know this. The sergeant's jaw worked. He knew it. He knew that any move that could be construed as violating the fresh peace would land him tied to a desk for the rest of his career. Kane swallowed the taste of strategy and said, We wait until morning. If your father comes, we hear him. And so the night formalized itself. Men took up posts at the barn, at the well, under the cottonwoods. Ezekiel worked by lamplight again, the flame painting Ayanna's profile into something almost ceremonial, all planes and steadiness. He could feel, Kane's eyes on his back, the kind of gaze that counts a neck like it's already measured a rope. Why did she refuse him? Ezekiel asked at last, nodding toward Etel. Ayanna's answer came without ornament. Chief's son beats women. Lost 2 babies for it. Etel saw. She met his gaze full on. Some cages worse than death. Truth in this country had a way of sounding like prophecy. They finished the binding in silence. Outside, coyotes ran a brief argument with the owls, and the marshals muttered soft as insects. Ezekiel tried to sleep. Sleep laughed at him and walked off. He counted the breaths of the women he had chosen and then been chosen to save. Etel's fever broke toward 3. She woke clear, thanked him again with a gravity that made him feel both taller and smaller, and traded a look with her sister over. His shoulder that had weight in it he couldn't translate. Ayanna moved to the window, watched the ridge. Different kind of light, she said finally. Dawn near. Ezekiel stood, every joint suddenly older. He palmed the adoption he didn't yet have, the hope he wouldn't dare name. Your father will come? He asked. Ayanna nodded. He will speak Apache law and federal law. We taught him both words. What happens if law and law disagree? Ezekiel said, because he needed to hear her say it. Ayana's mouth lifted at one corner, something like humor, but more complicated. Then wisdom decides. The eastern sky began to unbutton itself. Kane stepped from behind his makeshift barricade, rifle ready, eyes narrowed against the first unblessed light. "If that's a war party," he called, "we start shooting." Ayana straightened. The yard rearranged itself around the fact of her. "My father comes as promised," she said. "He will speak for us." The riders emerged from the dust, not many, 6 in all, but arranged with the geometry of respect, Chief Nailish in the center, elders flanking like punctuation marks. They dismounted as one, and the chief walked forward with the quiet arrogance of a man who has survived longer than other men wanted him to. His eyes were the kind that saw the first move and the end game at once. "Marshal Kane," he said, in perfect English that made a couple of deputies look at their boots. "You hold my daughters as prisoners. This makes problem." Kane lifted his badge, sunlight catching it the way it likes to be caught. "Your daughters killed settlers at the Morrison place. We bring them in." "Morrison tried to force himself on them," the chief said, voice as smooth as a creek after flood. "They defended honor. Apache law justifies. Treaty recognizes Apache law for tribal matters." The chessboard set itself down between them, 32 pieces of custom and consequence. Ezekiel watched men who could kill decide to talk instead, watched them try to turn blood into precedent. "Even if that's true," Kane said, "this rancher broke federal law. He harbored fugitives." Chief Nailish turned fully to Ezekiel. "You are Ezekiel Marsh," he said. His gaze weighed and measured. "You pulled my youngest from drowning." "Yes, Chief. Apache law says I owe you life for life," the chief said, and when he spoke, the yard hushed. "But you also saved 2 more, my daughters. This makes debt larger than simple payment." He reached into a saddlebag and lifted something that made even Kane's hands still, the necklace of bone and silver that belonged only on the necks of family. The chief held it where sunlight found the engraving. "3 lives create obligation beyond blood debt. Ezekiel Marsh, by deed and honor. You become my son." Kane's rifle slipped in his grip. "You can't just—" "Treaty says we can. Adopt," the chief cut in, polite as a door closing. "Your law protects adopted Apache family from persecution." He looked at Ezekiel. "Do you accept my house, my daughters as your sisters, my enemies as yours?" Ezekiel felt the weight of 2 worlds tilt. He looked at Ayana and Itel, their size, their steadiness, the way fear had not erased gentleness, and understood this wasn't only about safety. It was a chance to refuse the old geometry. "I accept," he said. The necklace settled around his throat, heavy as chains, light as mercy. Kane holstered anger because the treaty made him. "There'll be an investigation," he said. "Which is what a man says when he has lost for the day." "Let it come," the chief answered, already turning away. Then he paused, and the corner of his eye held a mischief that made Ezekiel wary. "Son," he said quietly, "tomorrow I return with different decision. Think on what adoption means." And just like that, they left him with law and a riddle. Adoption changed everything and nothing at once. On paper, he was son to the chief, brother to Ayana and Itel, shielded by a web of words hammered into a treaty by men who had never stood in Ezekiel's yard. In practice, he still had cattle, too, thin to stand. He still had fence posts and debts and hands that were better at mending than counting. But people came. Apache families arrived under the umbrella of adoption and law, bringing blankets woven with meaning and meat that tasted like winter saved, taking away flour and kettles and the kind of nails that hold roofs against wind. Settlers came too, snooping first, then spending, then bragging that they'd bartered with women who could lift a barrel the way a blacksmith lifts his lunch. Trade taught caution how to loosen its jaw. Under the new geometry, the ranch became a trading post, and the trading post became a map point men wrote to their cousins about. Go to marshes. The giants are real. Ayanna could swing a beam single-handed onto a roof line while telling Ezekiel, in the same breath, where the ledger was bleeding. Itel negotiated like a river wearing a canyon, soft voice carving non-negotiables into the bedrock of men who thought themselves stubborn. When soldiers drifted by on inspection, they left with coffee, stories, and the distinct sense that peace was suddenly profitable. In Washington, peace that paid for itself could pass as wisdom. Ezekiel slept sometimes. On the mornings he woke before the sun, he would find Ayanna already walking the fence, long strides cutting a rhythm into the land. He watched the way her body solved problems, how she looked at a boulder and thought lever, at a gap in the planking and thought angle. He watched the way she kept space between herself and everything she couldn't trust, including, for a while, him. That space grew thinner by the day until Ezekiel could feel it the way a hand feels the last thickness of ice before spring. He said nothing. Apache law had wrapped him as brother, and brother was a blood road with clear edges and cliffs. He intended to walk it without tripping, but longing doesn't care about maps. It sneaks through the border and sets up camp. Itel saw first. Adoption can be a cage, she told him, half smiling. It keeps wolves out. Sometimes it keeps spring out too. He laughed like a man laughing at a joke that might be about him, then went to split wood until his arms shook. Weeks bled into months. The trading post grew a second building, then a corral built with more order than hope. Kane came twice with paperwork and left both times with the same thin grimace, annoyed at the way ink had betrayed him. Ezekiel counted blessings in barrels, and friendships, in mornings without gunfire, in the way laughter sounded different when people allowed themselves to believe in tomorrow. On a bright morning when the mesquite had decided to smell like praise, dust plumed on the northern horizon. Not many riders, just the right number for ceremony. Chief Nailish came with elders again, measured, deliberate. The yard held its breath. Son, the chief said, after dismounting with dignity that never lost track of its edge. You honored adoption. You made my house stronger and this place safer. His gaze ticked to Ayanna, lingered, returned. But I am an old man. Old men solve one problem and make another. He paused long enough to use silence as a tool. When I made you brother to my daughters, I gave you law. I created a different knot with it. You understand? Ezekiel did. He'd been living in the knot. Ayanna took a step forward without waiting to be invited. Her right, Ezekiel had learned. Father, she said, I choose to speak. Speak, daughter. A brother is a good road, but my heart walks a different one. She looked at Ezekiel in a way that turned the world into a circle and put the two of them in the middle. He is worthy of another bond. The chief's mouth achieved the particular smile of a man who has lined up 10 dominoes to fall into one solution. Apache law knows this road, he said, and the elders' faces barely changed, which is another way to say they approved. Chief can release adoption with the house's consent. He turned to Itel. Daughter? Itel rose to her full, impossible height and grinned like she'd been holding the grin for months. I release him, and I keep the right to dance. At the wedding. The yard exploded, quietly. Kane wasn't there to object, and the Cottonwoods don't file reports. But the air knew. The chief lifted his hand for shape and weight. Ezekiel Marsh, he said, voice formal as sunrise. I release you from sonship. If you choose, you may be my son by marriage. Law clicked into place. Apache and territorial custom and treaty. The path he'd been walking around finally opened in front of him. I choose, Ezekiel said, because all the words he wanted were longer and far less useful. The ceremony was unlike anything the territory had seen that didn't end in footnotes and federal ink. It began as Apache marriages do, under sky, with witnesses who matter. The elders spoke old words that had survived droughts and generals. The chief laid the right pieces in the right order, each with meaning: a bowl for shared water, a rope for shared work, a blanket for the weather no one can predict. Ayanna wore traditional dress that should have made her look smaller but didn't. It made the world look properly sized to hold her. Territorial officials came because pretending not to see would have been a choice with consequences, and the governor had grown allergic to those. A magistrate fumbled the oath, rephrased it into something the treaty could stomach, and then stamped a seal like a man signing for a shipment he didn't order but had to accept. Washington's appetite for a peaceful, profitable headline outpaced its appetite for principle. "Frontier Union bridges divide," a newspaper would write later, as if headlines had hands. Attell stood as witness, her laughter punctuating the formal moments like hand claps in church. She rested one massive hand on her sister's shoulder. When the chief knotted the symbolic rope and then squeezed Ezekiel's upper arm with a gleam that said, "Be good or I'll throw you over the barn and mean it," even the marshals, who skulked at the edge of the crowd to count jurisdiction, found their faces untying into reluctant smiles. After vows, the yard turned to feast. Settlers and Apache traded plates and stories. The barrel Ayanna had lifted alone now held rainwater and flowers. Kids ran under horses and didn't get stepped on. Kane, notably absent, sent a deputy with a look that translated to, "I am still unhappy," but the deputy stayed long enough to eat, which is its own form of treaty. Ezekiel breathed for the first time in months, not the shallow breathing of a man measuring windows and doors, but the full breath that moves ribs and makes the world look like it has corners again. He watched Ayanna move through the crowd, a tall blade cutting through grass that leaned toward her, and felt something he'd forgotten, the calm that follows a decision that fits. They built for a season after that. The trading post doubled its reach. Apache families made it a stop and then a hub. Settlers who had sworn never to trade with hostiles found it useful to be less absolute. Itel brokered peace like a craft, insisting on fairness with a face that said resistance was an option but a foolish one. Ayanna ran the place the way she ran herself. No wasted motion, no performance, no apology. The investigation from Washington arrived dressed as courtesy and left dressed as confusion. The treaty held. The adoption had been lawful. The release and marriage had been doubly so. A young lawyer wrote a memo concluding, with caution, that this arrangement may serve as a model in discrete circumstances, which is legal for "we could do worse." At night, the lamplight inside Ezekiel's cabin carved gentler shapes than it had before, and not because the furniture had changed. He and Ayanna learned each other without hurry. The world had trained both to avoid debt. They created a ledger that accounted for tenderness and work in the same column. Trust arrived the way it should, with small, repeatable proofs. Sometimes Ezekiel woke to find Ayanna gone, the bed's emptiness not a threat but a silhouette. He would follow the shape of her to the fence or the ridge and find her there, looking. At the land the way a captain looks at a sea he loves enough to fear. She'd hand him coffee and say, "Listen." He would, and the valley would answer. Owls, wind, the far line of cattle that meant men would eat. And when the valley said, "Nothing," when it held its breath the way it had that first dawn, Ezekiel understood that silence can also be a blessing. The chief returned to deliver it exactly as promised, not as a thunderclap, but as the last click in a clock you didn't realize you'd wound. He came with elders, as before, the ceremony announcing itself by the neatness of the riders' spacing, and the respectful way even the skeptical settlers arranged their curiosity into a line. Ezekiel stood at the edge of the yard with Ayanna, still taller than most men's stories, still lined with a kind of grace knife maker's envy. The adoption necklace lay in a wooden box on the shelf, replaced at his throat by something both lighter and heavier, a ring hammered from silver and intention. "My son," the chief said, using the old word because he enjoyed making language serve him. "You have kept honor and made profit, a combination that confuses your federal friends and pleases my elders." A ripple of polite laughter moved like wind through grass. "But when I called my last decision different, I meant more than the release." He turned so the yard could see his thinking. "Treaty and custom gave us tools. Adoption, release, marriage. We used them. Now we use the next tool." He gestured to the trading post. 2 buildings, 3 corrals, a ledger Itel could run with her eyes closed. "This land sits between worlds. People come here to exchange not only goods, but ways to live without killing each other. I intend to make that official." He drew from his saddlebag a parchment heavy enough to be important. The elders nodded, and that meant the text had been blessed by the work required to write it. "This is a compact," he said. "An Apache settler compact recognizing this place as shared ground, under both laws. Disputes brought here are judged by a council of both. Prices set here obey fairness we can enforce together. If anyone tries to take it by force," he looked toward the road to town, "they will find both peoples standing in the doorway." It was brilliant again, and Ezekiel felt the admiration as a clean ache. The chief hadn't just saved his daughters, then given them room to choose their lives. He was building a hinge, a formal legal hinge that made their small piece something a governor could point to and say, "See, the frontier works." The compact drew signatures, elders with marks that carried weight, settlers who had learned the value of steady places to trade, a territorial representative who wrote his name like a man trying to get promoted. Kane arrived at the end, late. As a man who wants to be seen objecting, and stood with his arms folded, deciding whether to concede or be run over. He signed with a jaw so tight Ezekiel could hear it from where he stood. The trading post, half ranch, half marketplace, all invention, became an institution in an afternoon. Itel announced the first market day under the new compact and set terms no one argued with because arguing with her is a hobby. People abandon after trying it once. Ayanna walked the fence with a hammer and a private smile, and Ezekiel, watching her, found that privacy contagious. He smiled back and didn't explain it to anyone. 6 months later, the place looked like an answer to a question no one had dared ask. The little ranch that had started this was now a hinge in a door that moved 2 worlds without breaking either. Settlers rode out from towns to see the giants and stayed to sell wool, buy iron, and tell stories that sounded truer on the ride home. Apache families brought wares and news and judgment that kept prices honest. Federal agents came to confirm nothing had exploded and left with reports sharper than they intended. Model appears to reduce violence. Ezekiel sometimes caught himself walking through the yard like a man inside a dream. One of the good ones where you keep discovering you have enough. He would turn and find Ayanna watching him, the way a hunter watches the horizon, not for threat, but for the moment, a thing you've hoped for steps fully into view. On a clear afternoon, with the compact nailed to the post in a frame Itel had insisted be carved with both languages, Ezekiel stood beside his towering wife and said, "All this because 2 women fell in my yard." Ayanna's smile was small and devastating. "All this because you decided," she said. "Many men see. Fewer decide." He thought of Elizabeth then, of the winter when his hands had been too small to hold what was leaving. The ache came and went, softer now, because pain that goes unacknowledged stays. He looked at the world he'd chosen and the woman who had chosen him back, and found a private place to keep both. By evening, the yard filled with the low music of work done, animals settling, children inventing reasons not to sleep, laughter in 2 languages solving problems words alone can't. Ezekiel set his hand on the compact's frame and felt the carved edges like proof. Chief Nailish's shocking decision had never been a single moment. It had been a sequence. Blood debt turned adoption. Adoption turned release. Release turned marriage. Marriage turned compact. A chain of lawful, careful choices that made it possible for two worlds to insist on each other without swallowing either. When the lamps were lit and the cottonwoods took up their nighttime work of making the dark less lonely, Ezekiel and Ayanna walked the fence one last time. "Listen," she said. He did. He heard peace, wearing the clothes of ordinary life. He heard the long, patient roar of a door swinging on a new hinge. He heard tomorrow arriving, not as a threat, but as a promise they had both learned how to keep.